Hi, this is Brendan Davis from Bedrock Games and the Bedrock blog, and I'm here with Adam Balderstone, and we are talking about the short story Cicada Queen by Bruce Sterling, which I believe was written in 1983. Adam's been going through an anthology of science fiction, and we decided to talk about some of the short stories in there. And Adam is going to largely be our guide to this universe, because this is a genre or a subgenre of science fiction that he knows a great deal more about than me. This is cyberpunk, correct? Or this is at least considered.
This is Bruce Sterling and William Gibson were the two biggest names in cyberpunk in the 80s.
Okay.
And William Gibson being the biggest, but Bruce Sterling is the number two name for the most part.
Yeah, so this is a little outside my wheels. I remember trying to read Gibson and not getting very far, just to give you an idea of how little I know about the subgenre. But it obviously became a huge subgenre, and it influenced a lot of science fiction and science fiction movies. And there was even a book I read recently, Ancillary Justice, I think it was called, that clearly seemed to kind of have some of the cyberpunk elements to it. So it still seems to be pretty relevant. But I think here's what I thought of. We were talking before the podcast, and we'll get into the story in a minute. But you were talking about how you were repairing somebody's computer, and you clearly know a lot about computers and tech and programming, and I know zero about it. So I'm wondering if that might be the entry point to cyberpunk. If you think that having a knowledge... In this story, it didn't seem to be the case, but I'm just curious if you think having a knowledge of computers enhanced your interest in cyberpunk.
I didn't have as much knowledge when I first got into it. It's kind of interesting, actually, because William Gibson, at the time he wrote Neuromancer, really didn't know anything about computers. He knew people that worked them, and it's more about what he saw in the culture around computers, whereas Sterling is a pretty techie guy. So it's kind of funny that you totally bounced off Gibson, who's the guy who really isn't a tech guy, and it's like you did better reading the guy who actually likes to dig into the nuts and bolts of things.
Yeah, and I don't honestly remember what it was that didn't grab me, because obviously Neuromancer is it's a classic now, but when I was trying to read it, I think this was before it was really sort of established as part of the science fiction canon. So it was I felt more comfortable just kind of not finishing it. I could probably try to read it again and see if I've changed my opinion. But I will say cyberpunk has just generally never been one I've just never gravitated to it for whatever reason. Yeah. But I did like this story, and there were parts of it that I found a little difficult to grapple with in terms of I was being dropped into a setting that had a lot of concepts, and I had to rapidly sort of absorb them. And
this is the third short story he wrote in this setting, too. So there's a lot of things where he's kind of just dropping stuff in there, which you don't need to fully understand it, but and it's not like there's the same characters from story to story. It's just the same setting from story to story, but there's kind of an evolving history over the course of these stories. So you're definitely being thrown in the deep end.
Here's what the experience reminded me of. I told you before the program that it sort of reminded me vaguely of books like Ringworld and Dune and other types of books where mainly Ringworld and like Heinlein for the sexual stuff that seemed to be going on, and Dune for the world building stuff that was going on. But I felt that it was kind of like reading Dune, but if Dune were presented in a way where all of the institutions were a lot more opaque, and I didn't, you know what I mean, like so that I didn't have these hooks to sort of land on until later in the story when they started to gel a little more. So when he introduces, and I'll let you give a summary of the plot in a moment, but when he introduces the dogs, for example, I was not sure what to imagine. And
honestly, he never clearly explains those. I mean, they're some kind of robot beast things. I mean, they're kind of drones basically, but I don't. Yeah, I mean, they're called dogs, so I'm kind of picturing this mechanical dog drone thing. But yeah, then we get tigers introduced later, which are much scarier than dogs. But I think that was kind of an interesting choice there. It's like he just kind of. Your brain just fills in the details however you want.
Yeah, and so I guess my preference as a reader is I generally prefer books where they give you some clarity around the things, because I tend to get confused the further along I go. I was able to sort of find my way, but I definitely, the feeling I got while I was reading this was one of like swimming. I felt like I was sort of swimming in a soup of all these ideas, and
Yeah.
and maybe that was his intention. So I was trying to sort of lean into it a little
I
bit.
think it's a deliberate intention. Yeah, I mean, he is trying to keep you somewhat. I mean, it is partially the intention of the story to make you feel, whoa, things are really kind of
Yeah.
strange in this world.
No, and I can appreciate that. Sometimes I don't have the stamina. Like Ancillary
I
Justice did
understand.
something similar where the main character was a computer, so the computer didn't understand male and female pronouns very well. And at first it was very interesting because it would describe, a character as male in one sentence and then as female in another, and it would just get them
Mhm.
constantly confused. And the effect that had was you never really knew how to imagine the character. So I thought it was interesting, like the first 50 or so pages. The problem for me was, as I got further into the book, I didn't have a clear mental image of a lot of the characters, so I found it easier to forget who the characters were. Um,
Yeah,
you
well,
know,
it's interesting. You say after 50 pages, because my feeling is stories like this where they're kind of keeping you off center a bit, off, where you're not sure. I think they work great in short stories. Like this is not a particularly long story. It's like boom, it goes
yeah,
through, you're done. It's like if you're reading 200 pages of that, it's just like
I agree. I agree 100%, because that was my feeling at the end of this. Because there was a moment early on where I was almost angry a little bit, and I was like, I'm
uh,
going to really give my opinion strongly tomorrow. But then the more I read it, the more I eased into it, and the more I realized it's only a short little voyage. So I can,
yeah.
I can do the work to sort of navigate all this, and in the end, it was well worth it. But I don't know that I would have wanted to have done that for 300
100
pages. And
pages.
yeah,
Yeah,
uh,
I agree. I mean, uh, there is a novel in this series, and I think the novel is interesting, but it is definitely the weakest one because I mean, with Bruce Sterling's novels, he comes from a journalist background,
mm,
and his his novels tend to read like those travel books, which I'm not saying they're bad by any means, but those travel books where someone goes to a place, they talk to people, they learn
yeah,
about the location, you get lots of setting detail and conversations with locals and stuff, and it's like he's kind of writing a travel book about this science fiction setting you're
mm,
in, and which is interesting, but it's like I all the Sterling books I've read I found worth reading and enjoyed them, but they're not something you're not going to get that thrilling hook that's like pulling you through
yeah,
because there's something really dramatic happening all the time. So
yeah. I agree.
I think Bruce Sterling works better in short story form.
Okay, yeah,
But
no, and this was a very engaged. Also, his descriptions were very good. I thought that
yes,
he was his descriptions were so polished you could slide off them sometimes. Do you know what I mean? Like it
they're
was.
they're quick. I mean, he does. They're not like super wordy descriptions, but he's very concise. I
Well,
think that's a part of his journalistic background coming in
he
there.
finds the right word, because I felt like I was reading long descriptions sometimes. Like I would imagine something very ornate off of very little text, which I think is a
Yes.
good sign. Again, the only part that is confusing in the description is that he will throw a concept at you and not explain it. So it's also to a degree it's concise, but a concept you have to kind of think about. You can't just and there's a lot of concepts in this, and some of them are sort of real world concepts. Some of them are elaborations or manufactured concepts, which is
Mhm.
typical in science fiction. But usually, like to just use a classic example, psychohistory is
Yes.
that's a but psychohistory is clearly explained from the get go, and this would be like if you just kept throwing around the word psychohistory but never really addressing what it was. You get a lot of that in this book. So you get a hint, you get a sense, but you're not sure if your footing is right. One wrong assumption and you might be led astray. But why don't you give the summary of the plot so we can
Yeah, and actually, before I give the summary of the plot, I'll just give you an idea that the project I kind of took on, because the book we're working from is the year's best science fiction anthology from 1983. And I started this series on the fifth volume as a teenager, back when the fifth volume first came out. And I read it for years. I would read this book every year. And but yeah, I thought, the 80s were when I first got into science fiction. I'd like to revisit it. And I thought, as a project, I'd like to go through and start with the first volume and kind of go through and look at these stories, with comics. The 80s were a long time ago now. It's like when people talk about classic science fiction, they don't often mention the 80s. And I thought, well, people talk about 80s science fiction movies all the time, that kind of thing. But it's like, how well does all this stuff hold up, with the passage of time?
How far back does this book go? Like, this is 1983, but what years are covered by this series?
This series, this is the first volume. It starts in 1983.
Okay. So there isn't like a 1967 or 19. This is
no,
where it starts.
no.
Okay.
That's why I thought this was a good anthology series to use, because this is kind of one that began in the 80s.
Okay.
So it's and then it continues through this still comes out every year. There's the fact whether I'm actually going to succeed in rereading the entire series again is debatable, because that's a lot of ground to cover. But when I mentioned I was doing this, Brendan thought, well, yeah, we could do some. It would be interesting to do some of these as part of the podcast and so on, from a context of what would be ones I think he might find interesting, what might be interesting to talk about from a role-playing perspective, and so on. So this is the first one in the first book, but it was also one I felt was worth discussion. But the concept of this is Landau, who's the protagonist of the story. He's defected to this other faction from his own faction. And he's been under watch by these dogs, which are these drone-like things that have been monitoring him 24 hours a day for his time on the station. And he's finally been trusted enough that they're going to call the dogs off. So they're having this big party where the dogs are going to be pulled away. He's finally going to have privacy again. And he's basically created this new form of lichen that's going to help terraform Mars, which is the reason, it's like that's his gift he's giving to the Queen. And the Queen is this alien that runs the station. So at this point, I'm going to detour from my, synopsis of the plot. And I'm going to give you some actual background here that you're probably curious about. In this setting, you've got like two factions, which are humanity's kind of splintered. You've got the Shapers and the Mechanists. And the Shapers are people that have gone entirely over to bioengineering. Like every person is just a bioengineered person. And the Mechanists have gone down the route of just cybernetic implants and stuff.
But they're both trying to alter themselves, right? Like, because that's the basic thing.
They've gone down two entirely separate roads. And essentially humanity's kind of divided into two species to an extent through this. And they don't get along with each other. But there are these aliens called the Investors that have contacted the solar system, and they have interstellar travel, and they're willing to take people around to other systems and stuff, but they won't share any of their secrets. And they're kind of dealing with humanity in a business sense. And the station, CK Station, which is where the story is set, an investor that was exiled from that alien race, she's kind of set up her own station in our solar system, and she is pulling people that have defected from the Mechanist group and the Shaper Mechanist group. So you basically got this station that's kind of protected by this alien queen, and has got this mishmash of Shapers and Mechanists. So it creates an interesting story where you've got these characters working together that would usually be on opposing sides. So that's I wonder if that helps you as far as understanding the setting.
No, it does. It clarifies a lot of things. And I was sort of content to read it with a little bit of fogginess around the around the house.
Yeah, I thought about sending you like an email and going, oh well, here's all the background to this story and stuff. I thought, no, just
Yeah,
see.
no, I had to find my way, and again, at some places it was not always 100% clear to me, but it was still kind of intriguing. So once I got past the initial frustration of, man, he's just not going to explain things to me, is he? Then
Yeah.
I sort of fell into it more. Um, but yeah, so I'm sorry. Continue with your synopsis if you weren't
Yes.
done.
So yeah, but he has a kind of a patron on the station called Wellspring, who is this apparently hundreds of years old mysterious figure who it's got a lot of schemes going on, and he's the favorite of the queen that runs the station, and so he presents the lichen to the queen as the gift, and Wellspring is very very much into wanting to terraform Mars. A lot of this goes around that. There's kind of two seems to be two factions on the station. One's just more pragmatic, wants to day to day make a profit,
Yeah.
because there's really no profit in terraforming Mars. I mean, you created this habitable setting, but then it's up for grabs by anyone. So the more pragmatic faction is opposed to that. But yeah, the story gets very murky past this point. So it's the feel of this story to me. It's a lot like one of those 40s noir kind of movies where you're kind of intrigued and you're interested the whole way, but it it you're never entirely sure what people's
Yeah.
motivations are and who's telling the truth. Because even having read this story multiple times, there's a lot of things I don't know. We hear multiple stories about Wellspring's background, for example, but which one's the true one? I
Yeah.
don't know.
Well,
We have a
it also kind of ends a little bit like 2001 for me, where
yeah,
you have this. I mean, there's like a transhuman element to the story, I would say, uh, and it get and whereas Clark is sort of, he's got sort of this idea of almost like a natural progression to something less physical and more enlightened as time goes on. Even if there's like a moment where the switch is pulled, it sort of feels right. This felt like a much darker take
yes,
on that. So he kind of reminded me of Dave, sort of, sort of transforming in even the way that section of the story occurred. It wasn't like you got a really clearly laid out line of things that happened. He kind of jumped around a little bit at key points. Like all of a sudden he
yes.
had this big surgery, and there was no description of the surgery, right? You just nope, he's just there, and you only find out how changed he is when he talks to what's her name, Valerie,
Yes.
and she's like, your voice is different, and like there's like this dawning horror of like, oh my god, this guy is like he doesn't even have like a normal voice. He's
Well, on
oh, go
top of
ahead.
that too, Valerie's a shaper, and he's had this surgery on him where he's been made into this lobster
Yeah.
thing, and which are these mechanists that can live in outer space in hard vacuum, and it's like to her, it's like to a shaper, becoming a mechanist, it's like it's like a Mac person buying a Windows
Yeah.
computer. It's an
I
unimaginable
would say it's
horror.
even a little bigger than that. But yeah, no.
Yeah.
But I just loved what really got me was the voice. When I realized his voice was changed, that really unnerved me a lot.
Yeah.
So I thought that was very effective. And again, it's like a much darker version kind of what happened to Dave, and the protagonist doesn't seem to be aware of the
Yeah.
gravity of it. Was I correct in getting the sense that he was just kind of like,
That yeah, I have the same reading. I mean, it's ambiguous. I'll tell you one thing that I found interesting. I read the story another time last night, and something that really jumped out at me is Wellspring is one of the pivotal stories in this character, but we almost never see him. He shows up at the party at the beginning, says a few words, disappears off the scene. Then, when he arranges for the surgery that Landau gets to become the lobster, we never have any dialogue with him. It's like, oh, I found Wellspring, and Wellspring introduced me to Modem, who set up the surgery, and it's like Sterling is deliberately keeping you from seeing many scenes of Wellspring, so Wellspring remains this enigmatic
no?
character. And
Oh, go
oh,
ahead.
go
Go
on.
ahead. No, no, no. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, and then like you said, at the end of the story, there's this change, and by the final part of it, it's like the story is pulling back from Landau. It's like we don't, the early part of the story, Landau's kind of our viewpoint. We're kind of seeing through Landau's eyes to an extent, but by the end, even though he's still telling the story, it's like he doesn't seem like a reliable narrator anymore by the end of the story.
No, because again, he's totally not like. Again, there's a minor thing where it's suggested that this surgery is a temporary thing, but somehow I just don't buy that. It seemed like
that seemed dubious to me.
and again, the character, he just does not. He's sort of talking about how unhuman the lobsters are. He sort of describes how their favorite things to do are like nothing like what humans like to do, and he kind of seems to have contempt for them. Yet he's one of them, so he just isn't even. He's just not self-aware enough to realize that he's become a lobster. It seems, and so I found it interesting, but like you, I think it does suggest he's not a very reliable narrator, and I guess I was going to ask if more information about Wellspring was revealed in other stories, because I was even wondering if there was like maybe a Tyler Durden type thing going on with Wellspring, or do you know what I mean? Like like we just
the end they have people think that Landau, like, because Wellspring, spoiler, dies in the story, and then Landau kind of comes out, and finishes Wellspring's plan to terraform Mars, and so a lot of people think in the story that Wellspring, this Landau is really Wellspring. He's just taken on Landau's identity because he lived so long, and Landau's perfectly happy to allow that to happen. But yeah, it definitely that Tyler Durden question of is there some greater connection going on here does come to mind,
and also. The love interest, his love interest, Valerie, is a psychopath. She's like murderously crazy, right? Like, and so it's just and the main character is kind of presented as a little bit of a nerd, wouldn't you say? Like, he doesn't seem like a.
Well, he's a nerd, but he's a shaper nerd, in that he's inhumanly handsome through bioengineering, and has great. Psychological insight, but he is a nerd.
But he seems more interested in mundane things and not somebody who would, be drawn to such a dangerous person.
I don't know. He spends a lot of it because there's the whole scene with Kulagin. Kulagin is this mechanist who's a friend of his that is, he's got Wellspring as a mentor, who's the dreamer one, and Kulagin is just this mechanist who's very pragmatic, spells all the time.
And I should say, I kept getting Wellspring and Kulagin confused for some reason. Maybe because they were just the only, like, two other people that he really seemed to have connections to. Yeah, that weren't romantic or antagonistic.
His relationship with Valerie is very romantic. It's in the sense, not saying it's love, but just in that it's very much he has this idea of Valerie, but it doesn't seem like he really knows her very well.
No, I would agree with that. Yeah,
and to be out of Valerie's insanity too. That's another interesting thing in this story is that. The Shapers have tried to create super geniuses, and the smarter they make people, the crazier they end up being. Whereas the mechanists have enhanced their brains by linking them to computers. So it's like when mechanists are very smart, they're just very predictable and uncreative. They're just they both kind of hit this certain impasse with super intelligence. The mechanists, when they get too smart, give up any sense of creativity or spontaneity, and the Shapers go nuts. So,
but yeah, so but it was definitely an interesting story. I when I first started, I did have reservations because they were dropping a lot of lingo on you. And I was like, whoa, there's a lot here to because I think what was his name? Was it Cooligan, the one who was sort of schmoozing with people at the start of the story and sort of.
No, Wellspring was the one
that
who
was
was
Wellspring.
schmoozing at the party.
Okay,
yeah.
so as you can see, my confusion with those characters is deep.
I think Cooligan was at the party, but I don't recall him doing anything notable. They just kind of introduced him at that point.
But that conversation where he was talking about, all these different things. He was just dropping term after term after term, and they were connected enough to real world terms to confuse me.
Yeah.
So, but it established the character, and it also gave me a preliminary sense of some important terminology that got repeated over the course of the story and explained further, more by showing than telling.
Yeah.
But you kind of pick up on it as the story moves on. But I think the thing about this story that really got me was the body horror element. That was the part that really affected me.
Yeah. Well, I think, you mentioned earlier to double back, about transhumanist elements and cyberpunk elements. And one reason I like people to go back and read stories like this is that in the 90s and the 2000s, when people talk about cyberpunk, they try and build this, it happens a lot in the role-playing community. They try and build this wall between transhumanism and cyberpunk. And I'm like, there is no wall. They're the same genre. I mean, there's this kind of popular definition you see a lot. Well, cyberpunk is if we had this technology and everything went bad, and transhumanism is if everything went right. And I'm like, no, because I mean, in this story, it is a transformative story, and we do have the positive change of Mars happening, but it also happens in a very cyberpunk way of murder and also, treachery and lots of people dying.
Again, I'm not as familiar with the cyberpunk genre, but I think whenever you have subgenres of science fiction, it's kind of dangerous for them to limit what the outcome should be, because the interesting thing about what science fiction will often do is they'll ask questions about what humanity is going to become, under certain conditions, or if this happens or if that happens, and there's always sort of the optimists and the pessimists, and I think that you should have both, and you should always have both, and there should be room for both. And if a genre is just dedicated to the optimistic view or the pessimistic view, you're not really having an exploration of the idea. So so that was one of the things I found intriguing about this, is it seemed like a direct reply to stuff like Clark. It felt like, okay, I have something that I can grasp onto, and there are probably intervening stories too that I might be unaware of, and stories before, but it's this idea of transcending humanity isn't necessarily always a good thing. And again, it's really, I think, the core thing in science fiction in general. Whenever you have a story set in the future, the unnerving thing about it is often humanity is so different from us. That's the scary thing. And sometimes that'll be in the form of, society is different, and they have these weird policies that we would never imagine having. Or, in the case of The End of Eternity, humans can time travel, and they have this incredibly longue durée view of what's good for humans, and it results in all of the things in the short term that sort of make human connections matter just kind of evaporating. So I think that you don't. Again, I like viewing this stuff as sort of a thought experiment, conversation. Clark says one thing, this other author will say something else, and there'll be and so this felt like it was part of that to me, and I feel like this feels like a story to me that like as somebody who doesn't read cyberpunk, I see a cyberpunk novel on the shelf. I'm like, I don't need to read that. I know what that is, even though I've never even read a cyberpunk novel.
Like I said, it's a lot more complex genre. And I mean, going the other side, this is more on the transhumanist side of cyberpunk. But even going with Neuromancer, which is this is the year before Neuromancer comes out, by the way.
Okay.
So I like talking about this story because this is cyberpunk before the defining work of cyberpunk came out and made everyone decide what cyberpunk was. And even Neuromancer, the idea that it's pessimistic, it's like, I mean, you haven't read it, but it's basically about evolving machine intelligences trying to get to transcend to a higher level. And I mean, that continues through the whole trilogy. It's like, Neuromancer's got a lot of dark violence and grittiness to it, but it's a very transcendent novel. Transcendence is the central theme of the Neuromancer trilogy. But
Now, there was something else I know you wanted to talk about, which is this came out in the early 80s, and we wanted to discuss whether this felt like it was a product of its time or.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm assuming you had thoughts on that, so. Um,
Yeah, well, that, I mean, that kind of is my thought is that it is a product of its time. That Cyberpunk felt a lot more, a lot freer in
mhm.
'83 than it would say in '86, a couple of
Okay.
years after Neuromancer. It's like, you know, after Neuromancer, suddenly Cyberpunk becomes stories of people that are that hack computers with their brain and are doing work either for or against big corporations, and it becomes a plot rather than this kind of movement.
You know what's interesting? A lot of things in the 80s were kind of like that. Like what Neuromancer came out in what 84?
84, yeah.
So I think to like early 80s, like say metal for example and rock and roll, a lot of those
Uh-huh.
early 80s metal bands, there were still traces of the 70s in there, and there were still traces of the 60s in a lot of what was going on. But then
Yes.
sometime around the mid 80s, after like Ride the Lightning and albums like that come out, you have this crystallization of heavy metal where it takes on a form that is just not at all as rooted in those things anymore. You have like a very concrete idea of what heavy metal is.
Yeah.
And I feel like you see that with a lot of stuff in the 80s after 84, 85. So maybe that's kind of what was going on here. Is you have a story in
So,
83 that's still tied to the because they exist inside of there there were cultural changes that were
yeah.
going on. So
Yeah, and I mean, for people that are interested in early cyberpunk, there's an anthology Sterling put together actually called Mirror Shades, the cyberpunk anthology, and like I would say at least half the stories in that book, if the person picked them up today, will go, "That's not cyberpunk. That's not
okay.
even close to cyberpunk. What? How is this cyberpunk?" Because it's like, it just really close. Because I mean, one thing too, as role players to get into the role playing community, we, uh, a lot of I was reading these stories before the cyberpunk role playing game, which eventually became, you know, the Cyberpunk 2020, and that was most seems like it was most gamers' introduction to cyberpunk. So rather than getting into it through the books, they got into it through this game, which gave them a very skewed idea on what cyberpunk is. I really liked the role playing game, so I'm not knocking it, but
Mm.
it really gave people a much more limited idea of what the genre was.
Okay. No, that's. I mean, I'm glad we read it because when you told me cyberpunk, I was definitely kind of like, oh man, like I said, I don't read cyberpunk, so I'm kind of like, and I have like an image in my head of what a cyberpunk story is going to be,
Yes,
and one of the
that
first things
was.
that imagery that is sort of and this really didn't have that. A lot of the imagery struck me more as, like I said, like Dune like in its
Mhm.
just in the kind of world it was building. And it felt it felt like uh it wasn't it wasn't like a lot of times if you read like a subgenre that's clearly defined, you get a lot of cliches and stuff like that. And this didn't feel like that.
Yeah.
And I guess part of it is that it was sort of in on the ground floor, so that but
Yeah.
usually when you go back and you read like the originator stuff, the cliches will be pretty apparent. Do you know what I mean? Because they started the cliches, and this I didn't have that feeling. I felt like
No, this is before the cliches.
yeah.
This is I mean, I don't know. There have been some. Burning Chrome is already written at this point, which is a story in the same setting as Neuromancer. So actually, the typical hacker cyberpunk story does exist at this time, but it hasn't. It's just another story in the
Well,
genre. It hasn't become
yeah.
the genre yet.
We'll have to talk Nick Seidler into coming on the program if we do another cyberpunk thing
Oh,
because
we
he's a big
should.
cyberpunk fan, and I'm
Oh,
sure.
we should have had him in on this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I now have great remorse, but
Uh,
oh well. We'll at least
but
have to have him listen to it and tell
yeah,
us what he thinks.
but no, but this is interesting. And now the good thing is I am curious enough that I might want to read Neuromancer. I'm not sure. I might like okay, maybe I'll give it another shot. Again,
Yeah.
I sort of was very I would say I became quite stubborn in not wanting to read cyberpunk.
Yeah, I know, I understand a lot of the things people say about cyberpunk in the role playing community is stuff that I'm just like, it puts me off. I'm like, no, you're talking about this role playing game you played. You're talking about your role playing sessions. You're not talking about cyberpunk at all. It's like someone talking about the time they played, Keep on the Borderlands and equating that to Lord of the Rings or
Yeah,
something.
yeah.
It's like it's not the same thing at all.
I never got into steampunk either. Steampunk was another one that kind of, sort of went over me.
Steampunk's another one where if you go back and read the early '80s steampunk, it's a very different thing than yeah. That's a whole other topic. But I know you need to go, so
I have
we'll table that for another podcast.
Yeah. I had a question about steampunk, but I think we can hold it for now. So I don't know, any other thoughts on this story, and the anthology in general, because obviously you've been reading it, so I'm curious if you would recommend it to people. What your
I mean, we're not obviously not going to try and podcast every story in every anthology, but we'll probably be doing periodic stories from this anthology series.
Yeah.
And it's they're all available on Kindle, so it's like even if you can't find hard copies, it's very easy to get into this, and I would recommend it. I mean, it was a great series back when I started with the 5th volume as a teenager, and I'm finding a lot of the stories in this first volume are things I'm actually familiar with already. I'm like, oh, so it's like the point being that even having not read this anthology at the time, it picked winners. It picked stories that would be remembered.
Okay.
So
and we've also talked about doing books and things like that. So I'm sure we could have all kinds of things in the future with science fiction. Adam and I both seem to enjoy science fiction. So I would say his knowledge is deeper than mine, but we have a shared affection for it. So we'll depending on what scheduling allows, we'll probably be doing other stories in the anthology, but also we might be going to, I assume, shorter novels, but still maybe going to some novels occasionally. And
doing some novels would be good too. Yeah.
But yeah, so we will let you go, and also if you didn't check it out, we have the Painted Skin discussion from Friday up on the podcast for Wuxia Weekend. Next week, I believe we're doing Wu Yen. If I'm mispronouncing it, I apologize, because it's a movie that I learned about through Kenny, and I haven't seen yet. So this is, which is rare, because a lot of times when we do these, I really have seen the movie before, and so now this is a case where I haven't seen the movie, and so I have no idea what my reaction to it is going to be, and so that's always exciting to me. But yeah, so we will let you go, and we will talk to you later.